All right. I am so happy to welcome to the program here today. We have Hannah Kuhary with us here. Thanks for joining me, Hannah.
Thanks for having me, Mel.
Well,
It's just chatting about the stars.
yes, that we chat about the stars a lot on Instagram. And so this is actually my first time getting to see Hannah face to face in the Zoom world, at least, or screen to screen, I guess we could say. We are screen to screen live for the first time.
Yes.
But Hannah and I have kind of not exactly, but we kind of have reverse charts. And so we always kind of talk about our me being the Scorpio rising, her being the Taurus rising, and kind of where that meets. And especially now that we have eclipse season coming here soon, where we're both going to be activated.
Yeah, it's going to be a big year. Big year of change, big year of, I don't even know what to expect, because we've got Uranus playing a big role here too. So, keeping an open mind.
Right. That's a good way to start. That's the thing with the Uranus. It's like, how flexible are you? How well do you deal with what you don't know or have control over?
I have a lot of fixed placements, so not great.
I know, it's so strange having all the fixed placements that I do, but then having Uranus on the ascendant, it's kind of like, yeah, it's weird. There's so many parts of me that are very fixed, but there's other parts that are trying to like break that up all the time. Or if I encounter that outside of me, or like something that tries to fix or like put it in a box, I'm like, no, it can't be that. You can't control me like this, and I'm like, I can only control me. So it's funny how that works. But I invited Hannah here today actually to talk about the prenatal eclipse, which is something that has not been discussed on the podcast before, and is definitely a topic on the lips of many astrologers' mouths. But also a lot of the technique that a lot of people don't know about or might not use. So I found it the perfect time, as we're like inching ever closer to eclipse season, that we bring up another facet of eclipses. But before we even get to start, any of this eclipse business, Hannah, who are you? Where are you located? What do you do? Tell us more about you.
Thank you. This is such a fun topic. I'm really excited to dive in. I feel like it's going to be a really juicy episode. But for introduction's sake, my name is Hannah Kuhary, and I'm a working psychic medium and also a professional astrologer. And so I feel like I have kind of a unique lens of how I use astrology. In fact, in regards to the eclipses and a lot of the more karmic implications of the chart, really started with a lot of my work with the Akashic records and working with past life material with my clients. And I started noticing that there were a lot of correlations of what was coming up during these readings with my clients, then cross-referencing them to their chart. So down the rabbit hole I went with my Gemini North Node, and that's really been a fascinating area of study for me. But I have 2 daughters. I currently live in Kansas City, Missouri. I'm moving to Omaha, Nebraska this summer.
Oh.
So yeah, why not just throw a move into everything else that's going on?
Yeah, you know what? Usually when you have angular eclipses, that can tend to happen.
Yep. So that's where I'm at right now.
Well, that is, I'm so interested to hear about your studies with that as well. I guess that's why I invited you on the podcast. But it's so funny when we get a rabbit hole that like you see all these correlations and things start to add up, and it's just like what I imagine Einstein like looking into his mind and having all these like just projected visions off it, like that are in the screen of our mind, and like that detective. Yeah, aren't you Scorpio? You're Scorpio.
I am. I'm a Scorpio sun. Yeah. So, give me all the rabbit holes.
Yes. It's like that natural investigator. It's like you have like the CSI, whiteboard in your third eye, basically, where it's like,
borderline obsession.
Yeah. Hey, I am here for obsession, as long as it's healthy. I think, a lot of times when we're obsessed with something in a remotely healthy way, it just helps us to become really adept at it, essentially.
Totally. Well, my son is ruled by Mars and Virgo. So, we've got polishing, and, we got to still do things the right way. So I feel like we're in good company here with our synergy and our placements.
Perfect. I love it. Okay. So, all right. the first thing we're going to talk about here before we even get into the prenatal eclipse is just the importance of eclipses in general. And to, to give a little precursor to the eclipses that are coming in the sky, which we have a solar eclipse coming up on April 30th.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's literally right around the corner. Actually might as well pull up the chart for this one.
Yeah.
As we chat about it for a second. And so because I feel like I'm like, wait, here we have some Taurus Scorpio energy together on the podcast. We can't not talk about the eclipses for a few minutes before we dive into it. But I mean, in your work of just looking at eclipses in general, what are the importances of the eclipse energy in your mind? Like, what do eclipses really bring to the table?
I think they're harbingers of change. And, from a traditional lens, I think eclipses get a bad rap. And we can imagine, our ancestors looking up at the sky and seeing the sun suddenly darken, and how terrifying that must have been. So I definitely empathize with, our ancestors to, trying to figure out what the heck was going on. But there is this kind of karmic milestone or checkpoint, I feel like, that occurs when there is an eclipse. There's oftentimes a shift in timelines. And that's something that I hear a lot just in chatter, but also through, my work with my clients as well, as they feel like time just dissolves, or it rapidizes, or it slows down. It just becomes so much more malleable, especially that portal between eclipses. And so I feel like our relationship with time really changes when we are in that eclipse portal. And I do feel like eclipses can really mark a specific time or chapter in our life that could be significant, whether those are endings or beginnings, but they usually mark some kind of major importance in our growth. So that's at least how I feel they've, surfaced for me in my life and my work. But there's a lot of ways to interpret ecliptic energy.
Absolutely. And, I totally agree with you with the harbinger of change, basically, because it's like our bi-yearly portal that opens that, like, that reminds you that, there is no constant in life but change. And it's so interesting to think about eclipses about to kick off here in Taurus and Scorpio, because these are fixed energies. And what signs dislike change the most? Probably the fixed ones. Especially Taurus. You think about Taurus, it's hard to move a bull, like
it is.
as we well know. So there's an interesting quality to that, and really it's going to depend how everybody's going to feel a change, whether that is drastic change. Drastic is such a dramatized word, but I'm going to use it anyways. Drastic change in your own life, or you really feel it outside of you, because your life might not shift in crazy ways if the eclipse isn't really configured to your chart as much. But you're going to notice all around you, because you see friends that go through it, family members, world, political situations and societal situations. And it becomes really clear that, something has opened, this vortex has sucked us into this. I love how you said this timeless energy, because it really does feel like that, especially between the portal, which is going to be April 30th through about May 16th, give or take. It's kind of like, which end is up, which way is up?
It's like those 2 weeks between Christmas and New Year's where you're like, what day is it? What do I do with my life? What's going on here? But eclipses as well, from just a really straightforward perception, is that they are a disruption in our normal lunar pattern. And so when we think about just how we're going through regular lunar cycles and having, new moons, and then our quarter moons and our full moons and so on, when we have eclipses, there is a major disruption in that pattern. And so that's where I feel like that change really comes from, is that disruption of what we normally think of as, pretty predictable cycle. And so, of course, we want to find meaning for that disruption. Well, how does this develop in my life? Or, like you were saying, in my environment, in my community. And I feel like with solar eclipses in particular, there's kind of a 6-month window that kind of ripples out after the eclipse, where we really start to notice those shifts taking place and manifesting. Whereas I feel with lunar eclipses, we have a little bit less time, but because we're doing more of that immediate integration or reflection, or, we're really going inwards to feel into whatever those changes or, shocking or erratic events could be taking place. So I just wanted to mention that the point of disruption, I think, is a good word to use for eclipses, especially with this cycle, because of Uranus being the ultimate disruptor here.
Yeah.
Playing such a major role in this eclipse narrative and the storyline. So it's going to be really interesting to see how it plays out.
Absolutely. And I think the almost blessing to this when we think about, because there's this disruption and there's disruption, right. there's different levels of disruption. And the interesting thing about Taurus is that I think that the disruption is taking place in something that is really rooted and very, very long standing, but there's almost this so much precursor energy to it that it'll still be disrupting in what has to change, but it's not going to be like as out of the blue, I think, as some Uranus transits can be, because, we just went through 2021 with Saturn Uranus square. So we got to really understand, Uranus and Taurus and where that is sitting in our, our charts, especially if you have a fixed rising sign, such as ourselves with that Taurus, Leo, Scorpio, or Aquarius. You're probably feeling it more than most, but I think we're all feeling it in some way, because wherever Taurus is in our lives, there tends to be a pretty stable component there. Maybe not always, but we're looking for stability in that area of our chart. So it might be a disruption that you knew was coming, but hey, you can know something's coming for a long time, but when it's here, it doesn't mean it's not jarring, or it doesn't ask you to change or think differently or upgrade or evolve,
Right. Yeah. So wherever Taurus is in your chart has already been undergoing some form of dramatic change. And I think the metaphor that I think of with the disruption for Taurus, actually, I got from Melanie Reinhardt, and she talks about eclipses. And I feel like this is perfect, especially for the earth signs, for fixed earth, is as an earthquake. You think of like the earth, the trees, the natural world being so rooted into the soil, the bedrock, and Mother Earth, needing to stretch her legs every once in a while. Otherwise, the status quo would just be carrying on for eons. And so she's stretching her legs and kind of, moving herself around a little bit, and that shakes up the earth. There needs to be some kind of movement in the terra and the bedrock, in the soil, to make room for new growth. Otherwise, everything would be suffocated at some point. So I think that's maybe a nice way to think about this. And I know in my experience, at least with this upcoming eclipse, I'm a Taurus rising, and my rising is at 10 degrees. So this is going to be a major eclipse for me. But I've had Uranus hanging out near my ascendant for a while. And so I feel like there has been a lot of personal changes going on in my life, but I feel like the eclipses are just that catalyst to continue to really make real a lot of the changes that may have been more internal that are now going to be carrying out into the more practical areas of my life.
Yeah. And I love that you bring that up, practical areas of your life, right? Because this is fixed earth, we're going to see results on a material plane. It's not concepts or inspiration or feelings. I mean, there's some feelings in there. Obviously it's an eclipse. But for the most part, what we're going to see is manifestation. We're going to be able to see it, feel it, touch it, and experience it, in our, bodily vessels, basically. Mm-hmm. So, it's exciting. I mean, I feel you. I've had this, I've had a lot of Uranus activations, squaring basically the Saturn Uranus square was creating a tense T square with my Mercury Jupiter conjunction, and in the fourth house and in the seventh house, and so there's a lot of partnership activity. There's a lot of so even last night, I'm in a Venus time Lord year, seventh house year, so of course Uranus is hanging out there. My partner's like, because we're supposed to move, and he's like all grumbly because we're not making progress there, and so he's like questioning everything and like feeling down, and he's like, I have to move forward. I'm like, okay, well, I'm not the only one moving forward. We got to do this together. Like, it's like he's playing the role of Uranus to disrupt and shake it up. But I'm like, but I'm like Saturn, like, well, everyone has to show up. We got to have a plan. Like, change just doesn't happen because you want it to. We have to like do something towards it. So it's like feeling, because Venus is going to be very important here, obviously, because she is the ruler of Taurus. And that's the one thing I really like about this eclipse is that we have Venus and Jupiter sitting together, both in places of dignity in Pisces. Now, granted, Neptune's kind of close, and Neptune, that's always a wild card in its own right. But what do you think about that backing of Pisces with this eclipse?
Yeah, I like this eclipse, if I can even say that I like eclipse,
I feel the same way,
but it's nice. And comparing all four that we're having this year, I would say this one rises to the top for me. The other ones, not so much, but this one, I think there is some really nice energy. The fact that, we do have Uranus, so close to our actual sun moon conjunction. There's always room for surprises, but something that I feel like has really been relevant in my life, probably because of this Uranus influence, is that surprises aren't a bad thing. And it's important to leave room to be surprised, because sometimes those surprises can bring in things that we never even imagined. If we're so set on having things be a certain way that we're not leaving room for something even better to come in, we're missing out on a really amazing opportunity. And I feel like that's also beautifully backed with that Piscean quality, especially in the third decan, of doing whatever it takes to fulfill a hope or a wish or a dream, but also needing to realize when we have to just kind of release and let go and let God, so to speak. But I do love the Venus and Jupiter backing of this eclipse. I mean, they're in the exaltation degree for Venus, so that's really beautiful. I hope that this could be a potential healing chapter or portal for the collective, that this could be an opportunity to make change that could instigate greater compassion or healing, or just to get in touch with our more sensual sides, and sensual being in the sense of senses, of how do I feel in my body? What has been going on for the last year or two that maybe I've been repressing or, pushing down or not allowing to come out? And where have I kind of been numbed by things that I need to come back into having some kind of primal connection with again? So I don't know. I am hopeful with this eclipse, that this could be, a really beautiful fresh start, something that could be liberative, help us break through where we're feeling stagnant or where we're feeling uninspired. So I'm pretty excited about this one. And I will just say selfishly, I'm glad this one is the one that's on my ascendant and not the Taurus one later. No.
Hey, that's you're like, thank you, universe. Thanks for like giving me, if it's gotta be something, I'll take this. But I think hopeful is a good word for it, because that's essentially the high side of Pisces. There's a hope and a faith component, and the idea of healing through letting go and transitioning, and bonding too. Pisces is very much a merging sign, and it makes me think that there'll be just more opening and connecting. And I mean, we're kind of wounded as people after a couple of years of a pandemic, and where, we meet the community and the world at large as individuals. What do we have? That's the Aquarius component to it, obviously. And Saturn is square the nodes basically in this chart too. So there's still that kind of presence lurking in the background. But it makes me feel like there's hope for more opening and more connection and more arts and entertainment and finding that, because when the world is so serious, I know everybody been talking about the Will Smith Chris Rock thing, and everybody's like, and I saw a great thing by Russell Brand talking about like what's behind this is it's hard to look at this pageantry of a show and like this this fantasy world of celebrity, and when so much is going on in the world and we've been through so much, you can't it's almost like the trauma has to infiltrate there too, because it's like you can't really get away from it because we're evolving as people into something else, and like what we find pleasure in or in entertainment or enjoyment, like that's shifting too. And I mean that's essential nature of mutability, is it is a transitioning energy. It wants to take us from one closing experience to introduce us to the cardinal that comes next. So it's an interesting combination, but I'm with you. If there's one eclipse this year that I'm like, okay, you come on, eclipse, come on in. It's gonna be this one.
Yeah.
Now, as Hannah stated earlier, about kind of like that 6 month window to which solar eclipses open for us. One of the things we always want to look at is for an activation is going to be when Mars hits that point. So just as like a reference, for those of you who like to track time, like myself, that's going to be July 20th, actually right before the North Node and Mars and Uranus all meet. At the end of the month on July 31st. So there's really the last bit of July. If you want to look to some serious activity with this particular eclipse, that is going to be the time. So yeah, so that all that Uranus bit that we were talking about earlier, and that disruption and being ready for whatever is going to shift there, July is calling your name.
There will be more. Yep.
Yeah. So we won't go into too much more, but let's just touch for 2 seconds on the eclipse of May 16th. It could be May 15th if you're here on the Pacific coast. But it straddles the midnight zone. But that one's going to be, it's going to be total. It's where the first one is partial. And so this is such an interesting, so here we had, Venus and Jupiter and Neptune all gathering as an indicator of the solar eclipse. Here we move on to the Scorpio eclipse, and we've got the ruler Mars conjunct Neptune in Pisces, and that in itself is such an interesting configuration too. What do you make of this eclipse?
This is so messy.
It does feel messy.
It's so messy. We've got, the moon, any kind of lunar eclipse in Scorpio is going to be emotionally messy anyway, because the moon is in its fall. So, that's just kind of one thing that we can't get beyond here. Saturn is in its square again between the luminaries here in a rock and a hard place. When I looked at this chart, what came up was emotional congestion. And maybe it's because it's allergy season here. So this is like front and center in my mind, but it really is about emotional purging and bringing whatever needs to come up to the surface. I think especially over the last 2 years, who hasn't been affected by the pandemic, by, things that have been going on globally in some way, whether that's in a physical way or emotional way. There's a lot of collective grieving that needs to happen, I think, for progress and change to occur. And this is one of those lunar eclipses where I feel like, if you need to just lock yourself in the bathroom and cry in the shower, let it go, this is the time to do it. And it's not going to be with some kind of set strategy. Mars is conjunct Neptune, ruling this eclipse, and Mars with Neptune here is like, I'm feeling sensitive. I'm feeling like my emotions are heightened. I'm feeling a little defensive, and I'm really confused about like, what do I do with all these feelings? So I think it's one where we should be spending some time privately to really process what is coming up for us, what is getting in the way of us being able to move ahead with more practical expressions of healing, how we can be more constructive with and through our grief, and also how we can be extending maybe greater compassion towards other people through these kinds of interpersonal interactions. So I think this one's going to be a tender one.
It's a tender one. It's definitely a tender one. I like how you had almost a Freudian slip there where you're like, Mars and Neptune is ruining this. And I'm like, it's ruling and ruining, at the same time. I mean, that's what Mars's specialty is. Mars loves to ruin. It's like, what can we destroy? But I totally agree with you there. And especially since the moon itself is in a trine to that Mars Neptune configuration and the sun there too. And essentially that Mars Neptune has a sextile going on to the nodes as well. And I feel like, when we have such a nice eclipse that comes forward with the solar eclipse, and here we have these open doors and things want to move on and move forward. It's hard to move forward when there's messy business still lurking in the background, if you're still holding on to certain emotional content, look to whatever Scorpio rules in your chart, same with Pisces there. And of course, Taurus, and, throw in Aquarius because no one's getting away from that, but especially this kind of water trine of Scorpio and Pisces, and kind of, I think it's going to be where a lot of that emotional content can come up. And everybody needs a good cry from some time to time. It's very personal. We think about Mars. Mars is the independent planet. It's out for its own needs. It's not that Venusian quality of the solar eclipse. That's like, okay, we're together. What am I uniting with? What's partnership? Who am I partnering with? How that Mars is like, what are my needs? What am I going after? What's my motivation? And I'm moving towards my motivation. And am I sad because I'm like, here I am fusing with my dreams, but there's all this other stuff that is keeping me from that, or emotion, or, there's this dream component, because I feel like Mars and Neptune, let's be real, like Neptune can dissolve and dissipate. So, and Mars cuts. So if something falls away, that can be very, emotionally disruptive and traumatic in our lives. But, it could be a necessary part of that, kind of like what you were stating earlier about the, this opening, and how we have to release some of the past and what we've been and what old plans and old setups in order to move towards the new. So, like let go and let God, I guess, or we could say here.
I think, what's also interesting is that Mars and Jupiter in this chart are in mutual reception, with Jupiter having now moved into Aries at this point. And, I think it's Mars looking to Jupiter and vice versa, and remembering that like healing is very much a part of our individual journeys. And, getting in touch with those more emotive parts of ourselves is also how we construct ourselves as individuals. Our feelings are very much a part of the textural fabric of our unique sovereign selves. And if we just, bypass a lot of that unfortunately, sensitive material, it's going to bubble back up. And I think that is one of the lessons of eclipses in general, is that if we are not doing our ecliptic lessons correctly, if we're not heeding the warning signs or the messages from the divine, so to speak, then they're gonna cycle back next time the nodes come around. So that's why it is really interesting with eclipses in general to note patterns and to think back about what you were doing last time the nodes were in this axis. What were you being challenged by at that point in your life? And how were you working through that, that stuff that was coming up for you versus now? What has changed for you? What have you learned in those 18 years that can now serve you as you're being kind of reoriented with perhaps similar themes or challenges or circumstances in your life too?
Yeah, absolutely. As they say, hindsight's 2020. So you can look back, 18 and a half years ago, or even a little over 9, if you want to see the reverse kind of
Yes.
nodal action, because you'll see themes. They'll be a little different, but you'll see this, kind of the same activations.
Yep.
And yeah, I think, and it's so interesting to piggyback off what you're saying with, the healing, the natural, the individual component, and having Mars and Jupiter kind of ping ponging off each other in their, each signs respectively, having the sun's ruler Venus, in her detriment there on Chiron, like more Aries activity, Jupiter being on the Aries point, on the world point, there's a lot
Right.
going on in the world. It's
Yeah.
there's a lot tied into once again these new beginnings, right? Aries, the Aries point, this is a fresh start. And so a lot of times things that don't facilitate that fresh start, and they can be painful or bring up triggers and wounds, especially around relationships, around being able to cooperate and compromise and still have your own self feel like it is connected and motive and like inspired in life when with what you're meeting and pairing up with.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's going to be an interesting configuration. But that being said, let us talk about our actual topic of the day. I need to like wax poetic on something else for how long until we get to the actual topic. But let's talk about this prenatal eclipse business and what that means. These are eclipses before we are born that are
Right.
impactful to our life story and in
Mhm.
some way, shape, or form. So Hannah, tell us what the prenatal eclipse actually is and why we should pay attention to it.
Sure. Well, this is a big area where, I mean, really, there's so much that you can dive into here and pull apart. Um, but in terms of the prenatal eclipse, this is the solar eclipse that occurs prior to our birth. So we're looking at the solar eclipse as being that infusion of, it could be karmic lessons, resources that we have available to us that can help us along our path in this lifetime. The prenatal eclipse also reveals a lot of the karma that has been created in previous lifetimes, or it can disclose perhaps karmic relationships or events that as individuals we might experience in our life. That again is going to help us on our evolutionary path. So this is not a traditional astrological approach towards eclipses, but it's one that I have found to be really fascinating. And also there's a lot of just really interesting, I think, and surprising patterns when you start to look at your own chart, for instance. But it's always going to be the solar eclipse that you're going to look at as the prenatal eclipse itself. And because of the eclipse cycles, that's going to fall anywhere between, the day before that you were born, or if you were born on an eclipse, it could be the day that you're born. And it could back up to 6 months prior to your birth. So the nodes may or may not be in your natal placement as well. So it's important to go back and take a look and see where that eclipse fell, and then also just to translate that to your natal chart. What house does that fall into for you? Does it make aspect to any of your natal planets or angles? And also the sign that it's in is really relevant. We can talk about that too. But that's the basic rundown about what exactly the prenatal eclipse is.
Well, of course, what comes to mind immediately, I'm thinking about if we're looking at the solar eclipse, because that's essentially triggering one side of the node. So is there a difference between whether the north node is being triggered or the south node?
That's a great question. So in my study of this, I found that if there is a north node activation, that makes it a little bit easier for one to move through and to realize a lot of these karmic scenarios or karmic lessons. Basically, you have greater access to your resources, so to speak. With the south node activation, there's a lot that's being brought in from the past. And so that can produce more challenges. I don't want to say that if you're born with a solar eclipse in the south node, that's a major detriment to you, because we also have to look at whether it's a total solar eclipse, a partial, or an annular solar eclipse too, because eclipses in general interactions with light, right? So you've got the sun, the moon, and the earth, and those all represent a magnitude or a bigness of how that light is being shown. And you can think of the prenatal eclipse as a bridge of consciousness while we're still in the womb. I mean, this is energy that is being kind of infused upon us when we are still being gestated in our mother. So it's not necessarily a conscious part of our personality or a conscious part of our life experience right away, but it's something that starts to trickle out over time. And I do think of the energy of the prenatal eclipse as something that, connects us to the ethers, as well as our soul path or our soul growth. But, eclipses are also going to have collective themes as well, since someone born around the same time as you would likely have the same, prenatal eclipse, but where it falls in the chart is how it's going to be, significant for, each individual.
Yeah. And so, well, karma, it's a hot
It's a
word,
hot word.
topic. Karma.
Yes.
Oh my goodness. So, I mean, the implication of karma in these prenatal eclipses, right? Because it's before we even get here. So it seems like if, how are these eclipses aligned with karma? Or maybe even before we even say that, what is karma in your mind, Hannah? What is karma to begin with?
So I think it's a good idea to clarify when we're using terms like karma, what that exactly implies, because in Hinduism and Buddhism, karma is in reference to the sum of a person's actions in this and previous lifetimes or previous states of existence that helps to decide the future or their fate. In modern conversation, many people refer to as karma as simply another way to define fate or destiny or spiritual cause and effect. So I don't want to restrict karma to having to be a certain way. I'm choosing to use this word in a more modern application as an association from what we're bringing to the past that could be experiencing into the future. And as I mentioned at the beginning of our chat, that I work a lot in the Akashic records, and something that I'm choosing to kind of draw in here is karma as it relates to soul contracts. So that's basically assuming that our souls have particular lessons or experiences that they want, or we want to experience in this lifetime through incarnation, that we sign up to experience. And that can also be understood as the karma, so to speak, that could be coming up in your chart. So it's going to be different for everybody, but I think talking about the prenatal eclipse, you have to be comfortable with this idea of previous lifetimes, past incarnations. I know I'm sure that there will be some people that will listen to this and be a little bit like, I don't know about this with astrology, but it's a really interesting concept, and one that I've just been open to kind of rolling with. So
yeah, it's investigate, see how it sits with you, and really I go from there. I do find it interesting with the solar eclipse, because I was looking at the prenatal eclipse for myself, and the solar eclipse was at 7 degrees Pisces it was South Node eclipse, but it wasn't the most recent one. The most recent to my birth was the lunar eclipse at 27 degrees of Virgo. And when I was doing all my research of like activation, it seemed to me like that was the one that was really playing out later in my life of like things coming together. So is there any I don't know. Maybe I need to study the solar eclipse one, but I was under the impression that it was like the most recent one before you were incarnated, basically, as a person.
No, so we really want to look at the solar eclipse because, the sun represents our consciousness. The sun represents our essence and our vitality. The sun's experience is the hero's experience. It's the hero's journey. Whereas the moon is our reflection or our response to those circumstances or experiences. So the accompanying lunar eclipse is still important. And the accompanying lunar eclipse, I should also note, could happen prior to your birth, or if you were born in between eclipses, it could happen after your birth. And it doesn't make a difference, but it will always be of the same series. And there's lots of references. You can go look at your ephemeris. There's resources online where you can take a look at the Saros series and see what would have been the partnering eclipse. but the accompanying lunar eclipse can give us additional information about how or what resources we have available to us to work through some of these karmic significations. But the solar eclipse prior to our birth is arguably the most important. So yeah, there's lots that you can play with.
Makes total sense there. And of course, my mind starts going like, well, is there maybe important depending on what sect your chart is? You know, when we talk about primary luminaries, if we start to bring that in, and really these are just topics of research, right?
Exactly.
It's hard to say what the right answer is, but it makes a lot of sense to think about the impact of the solar eclipse, obviously, because I mean, the sun is our vitality. It's our right. Spirit. It's what animates us and keeps us alive here, and gives right. us, you know, that conscious direction of who we are and what we're here to do. So that makes a lot of sense to me. Yeah. So now, do you have, I know you studied your own chart within this. Have you, where's your prenatal solar eclipse, or any insights to share around that?
Well, I just also want to mention before I talk about the charts and the charting procedures is that the other eclipse you want to look at is the initial eclipse. And so this gets into the Saros series, and this is the initial eclipse is basically the beginning eclipse of the family of eclipses that your prenatal eclipse would fall into. How many times can I say eclipse? I don't think people should make this
eclipse.
Every time she says eclipse, take a shot. You would be dead on the floor. Okay, so you're going to want to look at the initial eclipse. There's lots of resources that you can go and take a look and see what series or what family of eclipses it falls into, because that is basically kind of like the heritage influence. It's also just kind of interesting to take a look at the chart of the initial eclipse as well, to just kind of see how that plays into your own chart. So again, just another point that you can kind of play with. So with the charting procedures, I guess I'll just answer your question first off, Mel, which is that my prenatal eclipse is at 19 degrees of Gemini. And so it's very close to my natal north node, which is at 16 degrees of Gemini. So it's not very far off of where I'm already having a lot of lifetime activations. And in my life or my experience, how this has shown up is that my prenatal eclipse is on the descendant of my husband's chart. And I've actually got a lot of examples of this. I see a lot of couples who have the prenatal eclipse either on the ascendant or the descendant or in the 7th house of their partner. And something I just want to clarify about, we're looking at synastry with other people's charts and how someone else's eclipse falls into our chart, is to say that, from the soul's perspective, again, using the word karma, if you have, say in this lifetime, you're meant to cross paths, or this person is going to be a catalyst for learning for you, it may not have that same relevance to the other person. And that's not to say that if your spouse's prenatal eclipse doesn't fall anywhere significant in your chart, that means that you're not meant to be together or something like that. I look at it as, where my eclipse falls triggers something or an experience for my spouse. And so that's what's important. And his eclipse doesn't fall in my chart. So, there you go. But I have another, there's plenty of other stuff in there, but but I had another previous relationship before my husband that really had a major impact in my life. This individual had a huge impact in my life. And their sun is conjunct my prenatal eclipse. So yeah, I look at the moon and the sun in particular. And I will just say from, if you're looking at your own chart and you want to do this, for orb, I like to keep within 2, maybe stretch to 3 degrees. And I only look at conjunctions or oppositions with the prenatal eclipse. So that's what I use for aspect there.
Yeah, that makes sense. And so when we're talking about something that's a little more abstract like this, it doesn't we got to see what's like the strongest. It's
right.
It's kind of like
textiles.
No, it's kind of like same thing when we're looking at like solar arcs and stuff like that. You're looking for those, essentially conjunctions. Correct. Oppositions next, but conjunctions are like, woo,
major for sure.
No ignoring that. Of course, yes. So when you were talking about the Saros cycle and the beginning of the family of eclipses, just for a reference, if anybody doesn't have this wonderful book by Bernadette Brady, Predictive Astrology, The Eagle and the Lark. She has a wonderful reference. I know, look, we're twins.
We're twinners. Yes.
We're predicting together.
We are. It's a great book.
It's a great book, and it has at the end of it a whole little appendice that you can look up your this prenatal eclipse that we're talking about, the solar eclipse, and you can see when the actual Saros cycle started there. And so, of course, when you said that, I'm like, well, let me grab this book. I have to know about myself. Jeez. Yes. My Leo was like, hurry up, find out.
You need to know for me.
And it's funny to think about too, because when we're talking about these beginning of Saros cycles, we're not talking like a couple hundred years ago. It might, if it's a new cycle, but a lot of times this is centuries. Yeah. Like a long time. And so I have my solar eclipse, prenatal solar eclipse was under, the Saros cycle 17 South, which started on May 27th of 933, pulling it back. And I find it very interesting actually that the beginning of the cycle, because we're dealing with a solar eclipse, right? The sun and the moon was at 9 degrees of Gemini, which is my Mars and the ruler of my chart. So it's interesting to think about the whole beginning of the cycle starting on a planet that is so important to me, and actually it happens to be at the exact bending of my nodes to begin with. So and what's nice about Bernadette, she adds a little she'll tell you what midpoints were there and what kind of the signatures was. Like mine was a Jupiter. Jupiter equals new moon in Uranus, Venus, Pluto node, and Mercury, Venus. And says the issues with this family of eclipses are of sudden success in group projects or personal relationship matters, happiness and love, thinking of love matters, good news concerning relationships or creative expression with a group. And I mean, honestly, that explains a lot of my life. The prenatal eclipse actually is in my 5th house in Pisces, and it has to do with, creativity and I've had good luck in love relationships, and no one always has it, but it could be worse. And so it's interesting to read that little blurb too, which I was like, oh, South node, but I'm like, I'll take that.
Yes. I think my initial eclipse was at 22 Libra. So that one's super close to, what's the fixed star there? Is it Spica?
Oh, Spica. Yeah.
At 21 degrees. So that's kind of a signature of a lot of those eclipses. And actually, if I want to bring my husband's chart back into this, his Saturn is 22 degrees of Libra. And a lot of people, when they're also interpreting charts, do look at Saturn for karmic significance. So,
yes,
you could make some arguments there as well. So yeah, it is really interesting and kind of fun to just, to apply different techniques. Again, this is an area of astrology that's not there. It's kind of like the Wild West. There is no one way where, you have to follow a particular, delineation outside of just kind of these basic significances of the solar eclipse being the most important. Take a look at the lunar eclipse, also take a look at the initial. Rose Lyman has written a couple books about the prenatal eclipse and eclipses in general. She also identifies something called the key planet, which is the planet that would have been rising after the eclipse in the chart. And she argues that the key planet also holds a lot of information about your most recent past life, as well as how you might have passed. Now, I haven't done a lot of exploration with that. For whatever reason, it just doesn't quite grab me. I feel that the significance in the chart is really more related to again, the play of light of being with the sun and the moon here and the eclipses themselves, as well as the rulers of the eclipse, I also find to be important energies to look at in the chart, especially through transits and progressions. So note the sign that the chart, or excuse me, that the eclipse falls into, because that's going to describe a lot of the themes in terms of the lessons or the experiences that you're going to be having in your life. And the house position defines the affairs, the circumstances that you can use as a resource to deal with these more challenging circumstances, or even the joyful ones in your life. So don't look at the house that the prenatal eclipse falls into as a problem area. That's really important. It's not. It's a resource that you can draw from. And I have some really great examples that we can talk through too, that kind of show how people have used that. But yeah, it's the sign is how we respond, and the house is where we gain support or have resource, spiritual support or resources.
I like that. I'm gonna have to wrap my mind around I'm still wrapping my mind around the South Node and the North Node influence, and kind of thinking about the difference. And of course, I'm going to have to go back, track the chart, look for what was going on there. And I mean, this is kind of something we can talk about right now, actually, is the actual tracking of it. It's like, how do we see this manifest in our, experience? So what are we I'm assuming we're looking for transits, maybe progressions. What would you be looking for?
Yeah. So I would start, first of all, of identifying where it falls in your chart. So really basic, what house is it? Is it near one of the angles? Is it conjunct one of your planets, especially the personal planets? Would be really important. And then what I like to do is actually pull up, again, an ephemeris, or if you've got software to take a look at the eclipses that may have fallen in your lifetime within, I would say, two degrees of your prenatal eclipse. Note the year and just start to think, what was going on around that time in your life? Were you dealing with a major turning point? Were you dealing with, a marriage, a birth of a child, a loss of a parent, a new job, something major in your life? What was unfolding for you at that time? That can be really significant. I think progressions are particularly powerful with eclipses, and I chart especially the moon. The moon's obviously is going to move the fastest through the progressed chart. And again, through my research, I have found with a lot of the historical and celebrity examples that the moon really triggers a lot of major karmic experiences, relationships, and turning points in the life that really relate to the kind of the promise or the suggested promise of the prenatal eclipse. So that's where I would look. That's where I would begin. And then, if you do identify a major lifetime experience that maybe you feel like, oh, there could be some significance here, pull up the transits for that time and see, where was the moon? Where were the planets, were they making aspect by conjunction or opposition to the prenatal eclipse as well?
Yeah, I think that's it. That secondary progressed moon is always a good one to watch, because I mean, we're already talking about eclipse energies as it is, and the lunar cycle, and especially maybe the phase of the secondary progressed moon, if you really want to kind of like hone in like details there, could play a role. But yeah, it's definitely something to check. And I mean, I'm looking back. Of course, I'm already looking back. I'm already charting on my own, my own chart here, and I see that I actually had the progressed moon on that point in spring of 2010, and that was a very pivotal year for me to start my own bands. And I partnered up with someone who I was in a romantic, situation with, to start a band that we ended up. I mean, we're still in to this day. Don't play as much as often, but it was like the beginning of something very big and very significant in my life that was playing out, especially in 2010 as a year as a whole. But if I were to and this is the great thing. This is what I'm always like, people journal, write down things that are happening in your life, because you can really like go, even if it's just a line or two, you're like, I did this today, this day, this day, and that's it. Because if you like to track astrology and you want to really understand what was happening, even in the smallest facets of your life, and I know not everyone has Virgo placements like Hannah and I, but
Right.
you're going to get the meat of it,
Yeah.
because you're like, oh, this led to this, led to this, led to this. Because what I feel like you're saying here is, these are kind of inception points of something that can be very, potent for the journey to continue, more so than it could be an acute situation, but it has an impact that is going to last with you or be developed for quite some time after it's activated.
Right. Yeah. These are experiences in our life that are not one and done. They are leaving an imprint, an energetic imprint in our life. It could be a relationship that's something that you learn from that relationship, helps to bring you to, your spouse, or helps to, heal something in you. Or maybe it's, a really challenging breakup that helps you to connect with like your inner power and your resiliency. There's a lot of different experiences that can come up from, looking at this kind of stuff. And that's what's so fascinating, I think, just looking from an individual perspective of how this plays out in our lives, and also relationships. Again, another thing you can do is to look at synastry between charts and to see how that plays out as well, which I particularly love to do, being a 7th house sun. I'm like, let's bring in this union and take a look at how people are learning from each other. But yeah, it is there. You could use traditional techniques applied to the prenatal eclipse. You can use more of an esoteric lens, which is oftentimes what I do, or an evolutionary lens. So it's fun to play around with. And again, like you're saying, to look back in time and to kind of reacquaint yourself with maybe something that happened that you didn't think twice about, that you realize, oh, actually, this was a really important day because it led me to be connected with this person. And, again, it's down the rabbit hole you go.
Down that rabbit hole.
Down the rabbit hole.
Where I like to be. I'm like, I just leave me in the hole,
Yes.
So, all right. So now that we've kind of like illustrated so many ways that you can interact with this chart, let's get into some of these juicy examples. I know Hannah's got some charts kicking around. So I'm going to let her, if you're watching the video, we're going to share some charts. If you're listening to audio, follow along. We'll try to, be explicit of how we explain it with our words.
All right.
But that's the thing about astrology, is it's like the best way to see it is in action. Yes, not so much the theory. Let's see how it's applied to someone. What's their story? And that's what celebrities are good for, right?
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Because they're front and center. So we have, and here's the thing is like with eclipses and the prenatal eclipse, it's going to be personal. So yeah, a lot of it we will see in historical figures as like major milestones in their life, but there's also probably a lot going on behind the scenes that we're not privy to. So, we have to make some assumptions here, but let's talk about Brittany. She's a fascinating individual who's been, kind of back in the media a lot this year because of the ending of her conservatorship. And she has a chart that if you want to play with her progressions there and look at her chart, she has some really fascinating indications in her chart by progression. But I want to take a look at her chart in reference to her prenatal eclipse. So let me move these transits out here for a moment. So here's Brittany's chart. She was born on December 2nd, 1981. She's a Sag sun. She's a Libra rising, and she's got an Aquarius moon. And her prenatal eclipse occurred on July 1st of 1981 at 7 degrees of Leo. So that would have fallen in her 11th house. Mm-hmm. The accompanying lunar eclipse happened January 25th of 1982. So after she was born, and that's at 4 degrees of Aquarius in her 5th house. So she has the 11th and 5th house axis that's being highlighted for her prenatal eclipses. And her initial eclipse was at 13 degrees of Capricorn, which is in her 4th house, which interesting, as I jump ahead here just a second, her initial eclipse, that 13 degrees of Capricorn, is exactly conjunct her ex Kevin Federline's IC. So I find that very interesting. So she has her prenatal eclipse in Leo in the 11th house, which really demonstrates this need for leadership, taking authority in your life in karmic situations or afflictions. It highlights creativity and self-confidence and vitality as being really positive assets that she can use. And she's here in this lifetime to really recognize the difference between self-confidence and self-centeredness. The sign of Leo for prenatal eclipses often corresponds with karmic relationships with your children, or a paternal relationship, which we've seen, with the conservatorship.
Yes.
Her dad. Yeah. And it's interesting about the children because both of her sons have Saturn in Leo. In fact, her oldest son, Sean, his Saturn is at 7 degrees of Leo, which is conjunct her prenatal eclipse.
When she had her first child, yes.
During her Saturn return, actually during Kevin's Saturn return, because his Saturn is also in
also
Leo.
On her eclipse.
Yes. So that's really interesting. And the 11th house signification here is, focus on fellowship, humanitarian causes, community, having the opportunity to grow spiritually through a sense of belonging and putting the selfish desires aside. Social contracts are really important with this placement with the 11th house, because it's through social support that one finds efforts or success in their karmic resolutions. And I think of this as the Free Britney movement, like the Free Britney movement rallying behind her as she's in her conservatorship, people being concerned for her health and well-being, people talking about, have you seen Britney's, Instagram or social media, and being really concerned about, what's going on in her personal life. Right. And by the time she starts to kind of put herself back out into the media, people are really advocating for her being able to live her life independently and outside of the restriction and the constriction of her dad and her conservatorship. So yeah, I think it's really interesting that, the social support and even the kind of like a movement or a cause being helpful for, her ability to find her own vitality and strength, her individual strength, being really, really important.
Yeah.
Now,
when I think of Britney too, I'm like, one of the things that she's known for, especially if you watch those documentaries about her, is that her ability to have to be a leader and have creative control in her entourage in the shows that she put up. Like, there was so much of Britney that was behind that. It wasn't someone creating that. Like, she was the center of this magnanimous stage show, and all the her whole team that would bring that together. Like, she had that vision. You think about 11th house being much like the 9th house, there's that kind of vision that goes along with it, especially obviously having a sun in Sagittarius ruling that eclipse area. That's a very visionary sign too. And so that's a strength of hers, right?
it is.
Yeah, and then that being taken away from her at times and more controlled, when it's like, wait, no, this is my kind of my superpower. And it's like, and it's cutting her off from her associates. And it's interesting to think about. And obviously there was so much nodal action that was happening with her story in the Capricorn Cancer. So I'm sure it all plays off together to give this whole big, picture. Of course, that's astrology for you.
Yeah. So looking at some of the subsequent eclipses that have occurred around that point, around her prenatal eclipse point, are really interesting. So there was a solar eclipse in 2000, which is what I've pulled up here, a partial solar eclipse in 2000 that occurred at 8 degrees of Leo. So within a degree, less than a degree of her prenatal eclipse. This was a really interesting time in Britney's life, because this is during the time where, first of all, she's going through her nodal return, which the nodal return is always a really pivotal chapter in someone's life.
Yes.
She had a major year this year, and actually leading up to this year, she had just swept the Grammys the year before. 2000 marked the release of her album, Oops, I Did It Again, which debuted at #1 when it was released. She was a guest host on SNL. She performed for the second time at the MTV Music Video Awards. And this was the one where she was in that kind of flesh toned outfit that was like dripping in rhinestones.
Yeah.
And, she and I are,
it was like the sun. She was like shining, like sparkling.
Yeah, totally. And she was also dating Justin Timberlake at this time. She and Justin were like America's sweethearts. Everyone loved them together because they were both came from the Mickey Mouse Club. They have this, they're both pop stars. They were really these pillars of generations, at least for me, for my generation. And her relationship with Justin, especially now what we know about her life, actually served to be a really defining chapter for her coming into adulthood and her superstardom. What's really interesting is Justin is a Leo rising. So you see this connection of energy here. And Justin's North Node is at 10 degrees of Leo. So it's within orb, 2-degree orb of Brittany's prenatal eclipse. And, I can't remember if it was in an interview or a book that came out about her, but she has come out to say that her breakup with Justin was like probably one of the most heartbreaking chapters of her life. And, people making a lot of accusations about if she was, cheating on him. And then he wrote this, song, Cry Me a River, that I think she was really gutted about. And, it was her dealing with a lot of adult stuff in the public view, in the public realm. And of course, isn't that just the energy of Leo, is having to be vulnerable in the eyes of other people, and seeking validation. So that's a really fascinating one. The other one is August of 2008. Let me pull this up too. This one's a little farther in orbit. It's at 9 degrees of Leo. This is the year that her conservatorship is established. So 2008 is when, she had divorced Kevin Federline. She had her sons, and, she had been making a lot of public displays of, her mental instability and just overwhelm at this time. And so her conservatorship was put into place in 2008. What I find extremely fascinating is looking at her chart by progression. So if I pull this up to mid 2008, we'll just pick February. The progressed moon at this point, here, what am I looking at as well? No, that's not what I wanted. Mid 2008. Let me move this ahead. I'm gonna have to go by months.
Maybe we get that into Aquarius there.
Get it into Aquarius.
Get it in Aquarius. So that is opposition there.
Yes, here we go. So mid 2008, her progressed moon passes over her lunar eclipse point and opposes then her prenatal eclipse at 7 degrees of Aquarius, opposite 7 degrees of Leo. And this is 2008, again, when her conservatorship is established. And then by progression, if we move to 2021, her moon reaches her prenatal eclipse point as of September of 2021, which is the same time that her conservatorship ends. So I find that very, very fascinating that the moon for her is really signifying these chapters of her life when she's going through, coming into a point of kind of like family exile and restriction. And by the time the moon reaches its prenatal eclipse point, there's a release there. There's freedom that's happening for her.
Yeah. And it's so interesting to think about, that first eclipse that you brought up when the conservatorship started was a South Node eclipse versus that North Node one that was bringing her the fame, the glitz and the glitter.
Right.
And then watching this progress of that South Node, solar eclipse, and then the progressed moon that was connected with it, and that had to go through a halfway cycle, with bringing up once again children, because a part of the conservatorship when it started had her children taken away from her to some extent, and part of the conservatorship when it ended was about her wanting the freedom and the right to have a child if she chooses. That was a big thing behind both bookends of time for her was the children factor. So that really plays into the Leo, and of course, just her natal moon there in the 5th house of children too.
Yeah. So really, really interesting, just how those major times in her life are being spotlit by her progressed moon, but also by transit and, via the eclipse cycles. So, it'll be interesting when the moon and the nodes come back into this place again, what she's got going on in her life. So that's Brittany.
She's like, give me a break. She's like,
I know. Let's
my
life. Leave Brittany alone.
Oh, well, that was a great example of Brittany. Makes a lot of sense there.
Yeah. Another really interesting one is Whitney Houston. I'm gonna pull up her chart.
Another diva. We are on train diva.
Yes. So if we look at Whitney's chart here, she was born on August 9th of 1963. Here we've got another Leo sun, an Aries moon, and a Pisces rising. And her prenatal eclipse happened on July 20th of 1963 at 27 degrees of Cancer, which opposite Brittany fell in her 5th house. So, her lunar eclipse, her accompanying lunar eclipse is in her 11th house. So she's also got this 5th and 11th house activation, which is really interesting, being another singer and, pillar in modern culture. So the sign of Cancer being important here in terms of experiencing emotionally and spiritually fulfilling relationships. And, part of the challenge with Cancer is emotional extremes being stumbling blocks, and there can be a tendency to hide and withdraw. And that can be, the challenge, the more the karmic challenge of the prenatal eclipse in Cancer, as well as emotional attachment or codependency. But within the 5th house, this is learning lessons of how to love unselfishly, how to need or how to overcome selfish desires and to utilize her 5th house assets in order to move through karmic situations. And with the 5th house, if you have your prenatal eclipse in the 5th house, there's also a connection to children offering spiritual support or karmic ties to children. What I find really interesting about this for Whitney is that her daughter, Bobby Christina, and her have shared really similar, kind of eerily similar experiences in their life.
Oh, I got chills just thinking about it.
Right? Yeah. And Whitney would bring Bobby Christina on tour with her. And she gained custody of her after her divorce from Bobby Brown in 1997. And Bobby, there's all these like similar names here.
I know, which is funny.
I know. Bobby Christina was also an aspiring singer, but she also spent most of her childhood watching her mom and her dad battle drug addiction. And both Whitney and Bobby Christina, passed away after being found unconscious in bathtubs due to drug intoxication. Also interesting is that Bobby Christina's natal moon is in the same decan of Cancer as Whitney's prenatal eclipse. It's not exact. Whitney's eclipse is at 27 Cancer. Bobby Christina's moon is at 22 degrees. So still
it's pretty close.
Still noticeable. I will say with prenatal eclipses in Cancer, moon transits and progressions are very strong influences. And we see that with her. In 1992, if I pull up a chart here, there was an eclipse. Oh, here.
It's interesting to see her, just her nodal axis to begin with at the bendings is the moon and Jupiter together in Aries. Yeah. So it even adds more to it, thinking about the ruler of her north node and that prenatal eclipse being square that configuration.
Yeah. And that's what I'm saying is, really getting to know the chart is such an important part of that. And, we could spend hours going through all of the implications, but I wanted to extract some of the major points here. But she has a very interesting chart, another one to look at by progression that's really fascinating. So 1992, we had a solar eclipse at 13 degrees with the North Node here in Capricorn, which is on her, this is where her lunar eclipse was. So there is a lunar, the lunar component activation here in her 11th house. And then if we move to, so this just kind of sets up what's going on at this time in her life, because by January 18th of 1992, excuse me, July, oh my gosh, July 18th, 1992, she marries Bobby Brown. And look where the sun is when the day that she gets married.
Oh, at 26 degrees of Cancer, right on that north, or on that prenatal eclipse.
Yeah. So yeah, she marries Bobby Brown. The sun is activating her prenatal eclipse. And around the same time in her life, this is when The Bodyguard was released. That was a really big movie in the soundtrack. And she and Bobby also have a really interesting chart, especially synastry, but looking also at the prenatal eclipse. Her prenatal eclipse falls into Bobby's 7th house. His 7th house is ruled by Cancer, and his prenatal eclipse is 29 degrees of Virgo, which also falls in her 7th house. So you can see that the two of them really, they were meant to experience something in this lifetime that was important to their soul growth. Unfortunately, I don't think it was always easy or rainbows and butterflies for them, but they were two people that were very karmically aligned.
Well, Pluto on her descendant, I think, is helping that a lot along too.
Yes, that's absolutely. But she's got some interesting activations too. Her progressed moon, if I pull up her progressions here, 1985, I believe. With progressions, we can kind of cheat just a little bit here. Her
that's close.
Her progressed moon was opposite her prenatal eclipse around the time that her album, and I forget which one it was that was released in 1985, but this was the album that she released that was certified platinum 13 times. She wins a Grammy that year. Also interesting is that her progressed ascendant this year is also conjunct her natal moon. And she's also got a progressed sun Venus conjunction around this time. So 1985 was a really big year for her, for a lot of different reasons. So
yeah, she was like America's sweetheart, basically.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's another really good example. But where the prenatal eclipse falls in a synastry chart is really fascinating. Diana and Charles are another great example. Diana's prenatal eclipse fell within 2 degrees of Charles' descendant in his 7th house. So that's another really, another one where you could argue a lot of karmic implications there with their relationship. There's so many examples. Jackie Kennedy and JFK, they have a ton of examples in their chart. In terms of where their prenatal eclipses are in each other's chart. Just looking at my notes, JFK's prenatal eclipse was opposite Jackie's Mercury, and Jackie's midheaven was conjunct JFK's initial eclipse. So they had a lot going on with their charts too. So yeah, it's really interesting, again, to kind of go back and look in time and to see what was happening in people's lives around these activations, and of course in our own lives too.
Yeah, it's definitely fascinating to think about. And of course, I'm going to leave this broadcast and go just pull up my chart and track it a little bit more. It's interesting that you used a couple examples in detail with the 5th and the 11th house, because for me, that's what's activating for me. So I feel like there's a lot of components, and seeing Brittany's and thinking about Brittany's too, because what was unique about Brittany's as opposed to Whitney's is that the eclipse itself was in a different sign axis rather than the natal lunar nodal position, the nodal position. So that's something to think about as well too. And Yeah. So with anything in astrology and any technique, you take it all in and then you put it to application. You just pull up charts, you see where it connects with yourself and your loved ones, your family, your friends, your spouses or significant others or past significant others. It seems like there's a lot that you can.
There's a lot.
Yeah.
There's always a thought with like, oh, well, your exes, they stay in the past and, what purpose did they serve? Well, sometimes it's really a major purpose in your life. And I think that the study, at least of the prenatal eclipse, can give a lot of validation to a lot of the hardship and struggle that we experience as human beings. It's perhaps it's all the Sagittarius in my chart that likes to take a look at hard situations or challenges and look at, well, what's the wisdom that I've gained from this? What growth have I gained from this? What purpose did it serve? What can I take away from that? And at least to just, again, to kind of identify what some of these patterns are and make them conscious can be helpful as they continue to either repeat, or as we're kind of coming full circle to our talk about eclipses and making sure that we're, acknowledging the work that we need to do, that can help to kind of sever or to remedy some of these cycles in our life that could be really debilitating or toxic or, challenging generationally, whatever it may be for you.
Yeah. And so since we're getting close to eclipses, I have to say that anybody that was born in like maybe 85, 86 or 75, 76, give or take, if you have a Taurus Scorpio nodal axis. Now, we already had an example earlier that, the prenatal eclipse might not be exactly in that axis. You might have had it, with the Sagittarius Gemini energy, but you in particular might want to check that out and look at where you're at with that. And same for anybody that has a progressed moon that is currently moving through that energy, either by conjunction or opposition, as we saw both were potent in the examples that were shown here today. So investigate, see what's going on now, see what happened before, and maybe even look into the future so you can see it coming to some extent, as much as one can,
as much as one can. Yeah.
Oh, I love it. Well, I thank you, Hannah, for sharing all this wonderful information with us here today. I love a good rabbit hole, and I think we have done our just Scorpio jobs to send many. We pushed them down into
into a new area of study. Because, listen, I'm going to be doing this later today or probably tomorrow, looking at charts. And it's always like, who do I share this with? Who wants to hear about this? Whose DMs can I slide into and just like share my findings? So this is a good outlet to encourage other people to just have some fun with it. And come up with your own techniques and see what's starting to work for you. If you want to apply a more traditional lens to it, start to see what clicks. I've got, like I said, I've been researching this for a little over a year now. And, I'm just so fascinated by all the ways that it still works. And I think that's just the beauty of astrology, is it doesn't really matter what house system you use or, through which lens you want to perceive, it always seems to work, which is cool. So.
I know, it's funny. Well, it's magical in that way. It's like any way you slice, everybody's like, this is the technique or this is the way, or like, and I'm like, any way you come at it, chances are we're going to say the same thing, but in different ways. It always happens. It's like, it reminds it to harken back to Bernadette and Eagle and the Lark. To me, that's very much the Eagle and the Lark. It's like the intellect, dissecting it in the ways and the different techniques, but then it's the intuition that comes in and says, this is what's important. These are the connections that you're making on more of a abstract sort of creative way. So we're basically all Eagle and Lark in it. With our different techniques
here.
Oh my goodness. All right. Well, before we go here, Hannah, where can people find you? What do you got going on? Tell us the deets.
Yeah. So you can find me on social media. It's at Divine Sky Mystic, and my website is divineskymistic.com. I've got an email list where I promise I won't send too much. In fact, I don't send a ton, but when I do, that it's like it's potent, I've got something important to say or to share with you. I don't have anything new coming up at the moment. I'm doing a lot of one-on-one work right now with individual clients, helping them plan their 2022, which has been really fun. And in fact, a lot of my clients are having their nodal return this year. So the eclipses are really relevant for them. And actually quite a few of them also have lunar time lords. So, and I'm also in a lunar year by Time Lord. So again, eclipses being very front and center for me this year. But I'm very active on Instagram, and I do also have a humble little podcast called the Light Body Podcast, where I do discuss astrology as well as other spiritual musings if you want to connect with me there as well.
Wonderful. So of course I will share all of Hannah's information over on my page on energeticprinciples.com. You can also find me over at Energetic Principles on Instagram, where I've been having fun making funny my reels.
Yes,
I'm like,
I love your reels.
You know what? I just love creating. I love creating visuals. I love adding music to things. And so it's a fun new way for me to interact with astrology and in a very basic way. You know, I'm not telling you like the in-depth things that we're talking about here today. It's meant to entertain you. So if you like to be entertained, come on over to my Instagram and you can see those reels and such. Just a reminder, I have my Heavenly Wind newsletter that comes out at the beginning of each month. So if you want to sign up to my mailing list, come on over to the website to do that. And like Hannah was saying, I hardly send out anything. I'm probably sending that out once a month, and that's it. That's all you get. And
it's a good one.
It's thank you. Yeah, so come on over, sign up for that. If you think that people need to know about prenatal eclipses or just eclipses in general, because we did do a little juicy, talk up of what's coming here in the skies in a couple of weeks, share it with a friend, spread the good word. If you want to leave a review wherever you listen to this podcast, that helps it be boosted in the rankings wherever you happen to be listening to it. And really, this is such a fascinating topic, and I'm so glad you came to share it with me here today, Hannah.
Thanks for having me on and to just tell you all the things.
Tell me all the I want to hear all the things, always. So I welcome you back anytime.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
All right, everyone. Well, thank you for tuning in. We hope you got a lot from this broadcast. It has you thinking about eclipses here in the future and eclipses of the past. So good luck with those eclipsins. And as always, may the stars be with you.